Hello, welcome to episode 2 of the Coach House podcast. This week we have Liem reading a poem by Domenica Martinello and discussing why she loves it.
How do we become new? And like in that way, like a protest, it's this kind of negotiation as well.
Matthew Stepanic from Glass Bookshop recommends a new potential classic in body horror he's very excited about.
Horror hits at society's greatest fears. Good horror that lasts the test of time is something that we can all relate to. You have to understand people better to write good horror. There's just so many things that you have to be a talented horror writer.
And Adam Hammond talks about his book, The Far Shore, indie video games, Superbrothers, and the Making of JETT, and why DIY video games are the new punk.
Part of the indie spirit is embracing amateurishness as a virtue, as a signifier that you're being honest in your storytelling, that you're not being dragged into the commercial nonsense.
It's time for my favorite part of the show, Poetry Corner. That's where Coach House authors pick their favorite Coach House poetry to read. Today we have Liem, and she'll be reading a poem called New No More from All Day I Dream About Sirens by Domenica Martinello.
No more mastheads, no more gatekeepers, no more birthing spontaneously from heads, new blood, new ripe glorious failure, no more tales, no more erecting of monuments, no more mass or amassing, no more taxes, no more keeping or owning, new holding, new myths, new syntax, no more fallacy, no more tied to masts, no more willful waxing of ears, lyrical, sentimental, new feelings, no seals, no new extinctions, no more news, no sediment, no new innovations without new stakes through the heart of new empathy, no more concepts, no more disembodiment, no more tills or tenders, new nouns, new softness, new storytelling, new epics, no rulers, new rules, so newly familiar until tenderness is new, yes, new, a new kind that no one can ever take away from us.
Thank you very much, Tess.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us why you chose this poem?
There's a few reasons. One very practical reason is that I went back to Domenica's book and looked at the pages that I had dog-eared, and this was one of them. This was the one that I thought I could do justice to. And I love it. I love this poem.
It's really interesting, and for our listeners who can't see, there's little punctuation. There is one full stop at the end, but otherwise it's just a uncapitalized list poem that sort of runs through all of these things. Can you comment a bit on the repetition in the list here? We seem to be revisiting things kind of over and over again. What do you see as the themes here?
I think a lot about repetition is transformation, and the way that in a song or just with a list poem, the way that when you repeat a word, it just takes on new tones and new meanings. It's like when you say no over and over again, it's never the same no, and the same with new. And there's something about the way that this poem has a kind of refutation and a demand. No is saying, not this, but it's also asking for something. And there's this kind of two sides, at least two sides. I think there's obviously more facets, but the way newness can be a desire or a threat, no rulers, new rules, depending on your position to rules and being a ruler. And I think that's something that Domenica is playing with in this poem.
There seems to almost be a political or social quality to it. Like it's almost a protest poem in some ways, right? Like it has that quality of like a chant you would hear at a demonstration, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. That's one of the notes that I made, that it feels like it's also like multi-voiced in that way. Like it could be a whole chorus, which, I was also thinking about the placement in the book and how it relates to the rest of the book, and there's new myths. And so thinking about how this whole book alludes to this old myth, but then throughout it's always balancing this reference to the epic, to the Odyssey, and then all of these parts of modern life. And thinking about, I don't know, how do we become new? And like in that way, like a protest, it's this kind of negotiation as well.
I think about what you said about its placement in the book too. It's, I think, the third last poem here, so it's kind of helping to conclude what we've been reading. And I feel like the tone has changed, or Domenica's changed her tone at this point. It becomes more adamant at this point.
And it does feel like it is sort of self-referential in a way, thinking about what it means to be new and to address myths and say no. It feels like it's hard for me not to read it as a kind of self-referential response to the book itself.
Tess, thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course, it was great.
The best way to get a good book, ask your local bookstore employee. This week we went to Glass Bookshop in Edmonton, Alberta, where we asked Matthew Stepanic, what are they hand selling this week?
Hello, my name is Matthew Stepanic, and I am the co-owner of Glass Bookshop, indie bookshop based in Edmonton, Alberta. And I'm also a freelance writer, a poet. Basically, I'll write anything that people will give me money for.
Thank you for joining us, Matthew.
Thank you so much for having me.
What book are you recommending today?
Today I want to talk about Neben Ruthnam's Helpmeet, published by Undertow Publications. Just read it a couple of days ago, and it's sticking with me. It's a very disturbing body horror novel that, I read it just before bed and then had very, very strange dreams.
I have not read this book. I heard it's very short. Is it a novella?
Yeah, I guess it would be considered more of a novella because we're looking at about 85 pages. And I love a short book. Definitely the pandemic has affected my attention span when it comes to reading. So I've been reading a lot more short stories and poetry. So I appreciate a very short novel. And but the thing is Neben hits so hard with this one. It's basically about a doctor who's being taken care of by his doting wife. Sort of the rumor that started at the beginning of the novel is that potentially the doctor's been cheating around on his wife with prostitutes and might be suffering from some advanced form of syphilis that's causing his body to fall apart, his nose falls off. I'm slowly trying to get into body horror because it's I'm a huge horror fan, and body horror seems to be the direction that the genre's moving in, but it's also one of those things that makes me feel very uncomfortable and on edge just to kind of imagine skin flaking away or weird red sores and other gross stuff. But what it's looking at is just kind of it's takes place in the 1900s, so it's kind of that idea of the way that women how much of their identities are tied into their man, and the person who she has nothing else to look forward to other than to kind of take care of this person. And Neben's really turning that on its head, because by the end of the novel we're seeing the wife actually being able to be given agency in her own life. So it's something that I don't know, it disturbs, but also just surprises, and we see a very sort of strange, unsuspecting kind of creature. So it's definitely something that anyone can put away in a night and then not sleep very well, but definitely something that I haven't read something quite like this before, and I think Neben clearly shows his talent, because I know he has a couple other longer novels, but does 80 pages very well.
We've done a couple body horror novels recently at Coach House too, like Fauna by Christian Bednes.
Yes.
This is a lot of literary horror, which is very cool to see too. It's not quite like the mass markets that we've seen before, and we've seen some like real literary authors take chances now too, which is exciting.
Yeah, it's exciting for me too, because like horror has always been my favorite genre, and I think it's one of the smartest genres that like doesn't get the attention that it deserves. Horror hits at like, you know, society's greatest fears. Like good horror that like lasts the test of time is something that like we can all relate to. Like you have to understand people better to write good horror. Like there's just so many things that like you have to be a talented horror writer, that like I think it's always kind of been, you know, literary, and just like finally getting that mark that it deserves. So horror writers are the smartest writers. I'm just going to say that right now.
That's a perfect spot to end it on right there.
Yeah.
Matthew, thank you so much. That was great.
Thank you.
What does Virginia Woolf and Riot Girl have to do with PlayStation and intergalactic colonialism? We asked Adam Hammond about it. All right, Adam, do you quickly want to just read your bio? Tell us who you are.
I am an assistant professor in the Department of English at the University of Toronto. I'm the author of Literature in the Digital Age, A Critical Introduction, published by Cambridge University Press in 2016. I'm the co-author of a book called Modernism Keywords, which came out in 2014. My writing has appeared in The Walrus, the Literary Review of Canada, the Globe and Mail, and it's been profiled in Wired on BBC and CBC Radio.
And you are the author of The Far Shore, Indie Games, Superbrothers, and the Making of JETT. I was hoping you could tell us just a little bit about this book and what JETT is before we get into it.
All right. JETT is a video game made by Superbrothers, which is a nickname for a person named Craig D. Adams and someone else named Pine Scented, who is Patrick McAllister. I shadowed the making of this game since 2013, so for 8 years. And as I shadowed it, I sort of developed a theory about the way that independent or DIY video games relate to early 20th century art and literature and punk music, and sort of developed a grand unifying theory of DIY arts and figured out how video games might fit into this. So the book is both an account of where this video game came from and its early reception, and also a big story about independent games and how they relate to all the other independent media.
As a music fan, for our listeners, actually, before we were recording, we were looking at each other's record shelves over Zoom here. But as a music fan, the idea of punk rock being a kind of modernism for music, and then in turn DIY video games being a kind of modernism for video games, I found really, really attractive. Could you talk a little more about that?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I've always been just most interested in modernist literature, and I decided to study it, do a PhD about early 20th century stuff. Like Virginia Woolf was one of my authors. And then musically, I was in like punk bands when I was growing up in London, Ontario, and I've remained really attached, especially to like the really amateurish side of that, like especially what's called like post-punk and the kind of really lo-fi end of that as it happened in the early 80s. But I just never really noticed that there was a connection between the stuff that I'm interested in. My musical obsessions were over here and my literary obsessions were over there. But there's like this very specific moment where I realized how they connected, which was I really remember I was like just killing time on the way to a lecture. And I often feel like if I'm feeling guilty about some obsession of mine, I feel like I'm wasting too much time on it. Usually right after the guilt, I realize, oh my God, this is like essential. It's going to connect all these things. So I was going through this deep obsession with post-punk and reading all these books about post-punk. In particular, I read this book by Simon Reynolds called Rip It Up and Start Again, which is about 78 to 84. And in the introduction, he just had this line that said, post-punk replayed all the major themes of modernist art and literature in popular music. And for me, it's like, oh, hold on. So like modernism, which I'm really used to, and most people think of as a time period. It's like, say like 1914 to 1922 or like 1900 to early 20th century. But I was like, if punk and post-punk replayed modernism in a different medium, maybe modernism is not a historical thing, but it's like an approach to making art or a type of style or even themes that plays itself out in different media at different times. So like this was this mind blown, like, oh my God, my obsession with post-punk music is just an obsession with modernism in a different medium at a different time. And the lecture I was on the way to give that day was a lecture about Sword and Sorcery, which was the first Superbrothers game. And sort of as I was giving that lecture, I was like, oh my God, DIY indie video games are the punk, like modernism has come to the video game now. And so like basically the next several years of my life was trying to work out this thesis and to test whether it actually made sense, this like delayed arrival of modernism in different forms.
At one point in The Far Shore, you talk about a beautiful indie video game. Maybe you can remind me of the name here, where it's just walking through someone's house and then looking at a desk and sort of like piecing together the story of what's happening. What's the name of that video game?
It's called Gone Home.
Gone Home, that's right. And you talk about playing it or getting your students to play it, and you love it and are very excited about it, and it just falls completely flat with them.
Yeah.
But like Gone Home is a good sort of example of this idea of post-punk DIY video game. I wonder, sort of like a lot like post-punk, a lot of it fell flat on the public too, right? Like some of these bands were really popular, like the Talking Heads, for example, and some of them just never got off the ground. I wonder if you could talk a little about why like this DIY video game spoke so well to you. What was the division and why couldn't your students get it? Was it an age thing or what was it?
That is an interesting game in that it came out sort of after I had my epiphany, and it really helped me solidify my idea because it's a game about like you're walking through a house, trying to put together this story, but it's set in the early 90s. And there's all these references to Riot Grrrl, and Riot Grrrl is like, although it happened in the 90s, it's an utterly punk movement thing. You could argue that like post-punk was sort of delayed in the Pacific Northwest and kind of worked itself out through Riot Grrrl. So there's Riot Grrrl music, there's posters for Riot Grrrl bands. The game is very unsubtly being like, hey, Riot Grrrl was this independent do-it-yourself movement in music, and we are a DIY indie game, and we are the same thing. Like, we are connected to this. So it was sort of this argument that I was making there, very explicitly making that argument. So I taught a whole course when I briefly lived in San Diego and taught at San Diego State University. And unlike at the University of Toronto where I now teach, it was kind of just like a do anything you want kind of a school, like teach any course you want. So I was like, can I teach a course that's about like, it's called The Social Politics of Indie? Can I do about like indie DIY in literature, music, and video games? They're like, yeah, totally do it. So I set the whole course up to culminate in Gone Home. We would like read Virginia Woolf, and there is in Gone Home there is a room that is a room of one's own. Obviously it's like a reference to this place where the girls go to like make zines and make art, and it is the room of one's own. It's like this hidden room in the basement. Then there's all the Riot Grrrl stuff. So we like read Virginia Woolf, we listened to Bikini Kill, we like all the bits were in place for then to get to Gone Home and for the students' minds to be blown, even if they'd never heard of Wolf before the class. Like I sort of laid it all there. And yeah, like I said, I get to the front of the class and I go to hit the like play button in Steam, and the students are like, no, that game sucks. And it was weird because like I like the game, but I do think what I like about the game is less like the experience itself and more the way that it confirms my theory. Like the way that it's saying indie games equals the new version of Riot Grrrl. And I think maybe partly students were like, less attracted to my theory than I was. But that game won a lot of Game of the Year awards. So like I had some real backup that it was not a terrible game. Although I was actually having this conversation with one of my friends yesterday. I think like games journalism tends to reward things for what they might be as opposed to for what they actually are as an experience. And because like everyone wants games to be so awesome and to like be the art form that, like I'm talking about especially like the literary minded games critics. It's so clear that games could be amazing, so that when one like hints at its awesomeness, you really praise it, like if it's not just another shooting game. So Gone Home garnered all this praise, but I think in large part for like what it said about the genre, and that was what I was responding to. And I don't know, I have assigned that game in other contexts, and students have really enjoyed it and been moved by it. But that group, man, they just hated that game.
I wonder, kids must look at those early video games, especially the ones we would have been exposed to, like the very early video games, like cave paintings on a wall or something. They're so minimal at this point. Like, I wonder even if, for us, video games and looking at a game like Gone Home, like it's come so far from what we initially were introduced as. This is a video game, you know, these balls bouncing between two sliding lines. For them, like, can they even appreciate it at this point? Like, if you started and the first video games you ever were exposed to were, say, PlayStation, and games like that with full drawn-out narratives, with captivating gameplay and stuff like that, can Gone Home and DIY games make an impact on people who don't fully have this original history of how far games have come?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think so. Like a lot of the indie games, just because games, this is another theme of the book, they're so hard to make. They're so expensive to make. It's just unbelievable the resources that are required to make a big fancy game as they are made in big studios today. It's like harder than to make a huge big budget movie. The indie games, the DIY games, the purest versions of them, yeah, they're not fancy looking. They look like old games. In some cases, they really kind of fetishize that and they lean into it. And I think the players that they tend to connect with most are people like I'm 40, people around my age who have nostalgia for video games from their childhood. So they're not trying to reach like the 20-year-olds. They're more trying to reach the older people who are drawn. Oh yeah, I remember when video games used to look like that. And there's the idea that there was something purer about those early games and keeping things kind of simple and making a virtue of the messiness or the like just the crappiness or like jankiness of the aesthetic. And that really, I mean, like you think about music, like bands that I love, like maybe my all-time favorite band is Beat Happening from Olympia, Washington. And like they could barely play their instruments and they did not want to learn how to play their instruments. And that's a huge part of the appeal. I think part of the indie spirit is like embracing amateurishness as a virtue, as a signifier that you're being like honest in your storytelling, that you're not being dragged into the commercial nonsense where if you're taking $100 million to make a game, or you're taking $100 million in investment from a huge studio, obviously you have to reach a certain standard and then you have to compromise the vision that you have in order to sell copies and all that stuff. But like something like Gone Home is an interesting example because it's a 3D game. It looks like a first person shooter 3D game, except there's no one to kill. And you'll find this in like a lot of the cool indie games that really, like, especially around like the 2010 era, got a lot of attention. They're all conspicuously, there are a few people there, like the Stanley Parable is a game about you wake up in your office and you look around and there's no one there. It's partly just because this is when these software became available to quite easily make a first-person shooter. So artists are like, cool, I'll use this available software, but I don't have the programming chops to like put anyone else in that world. So what can I do in that world if there was no one there? Anyway, part of the narrative of JETT is like you have these people who have a really grand artistic vision, but they also want to make a video game that looks like a big fancy current video game. And it's like, can two people make a high-minded video game with like really massive artistic ambitions on their own? And it's a really fraught, complicated answer. Like it's the answer is not a straightforward yes. It's very, 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 very hard to make a fancy multimedia video game that meets today's production standards in a small team. Probably impossible.
Real quick before we go, I wanted to ask you about the money aspect of it, especially in terms of modernism and post-punk, like we were talking about. Because I think what's interesting is in the Far Shore, you talk about how the developers, Superbrothers, had to then get all this money from a much larger studio in order for them to make this game. And I think one of the appeals, probably for you and also me, about music like punk and post-punk and Riot Girl and the beat happening is that they didn't really have much money at all. They were able to do this, and yeah, they had a record label with much more money to actually produce it, but they themselves were able to make their art for very little. That's just a really notable difference for me. I was wondering if you could talk to that for a minute.
Yeah, I mean, that's the DIY ethic. That's the thing that drew me. That's the thing I started making the connections. Like Virginia Woolf in her book 3 Guineas, which was published by her own press, Hogarth Press, and is one of the most badass books ever written. She says, you can't be honest. You can't say what's on your mind unless you are publishing your own work. Anytime you're writing for money, writing for an editor, you are going to compromise, even if it's unconscious. And she's saying this as someone who's publishing her own work. It's a pretty cool statement. And that's like, as a teenager, that's the thing that appealed to me about punk. The idea that you have to work outside of commercial modes of production if you want to be honest and, say something other than please buy my record. That's what appealed to me about indie games. And there are indie games that are usually very small scale productions that follow this ethic very directly. And for a while, I thought JETT was going to be an indie game following the DIY ethic in a kind of weird way, where they had made, Craig Superbrothers had made a lot of money on his previous game, Sword and Sorcery, which is an amazing game. Enough that his plan was like, take the money, move to the middle of nowhere in Quebec, use that big pot of money to finance the next game without taking any money from anyone. And that's how it worked for a bunch of years. And then they could not finish the game. Like, we're talking like 6 years. Always, okay, we just need one more year. And the money's going down and down and down. Sometimes, like, the game's still selling, so money's still coming in. But they thought they had a way around the usual trap. They thought they could self-finance based on previous success. But at a certain point, not only did they realize they didn't have the money to pull it off, most importantly, just 2 people, they did not have the skills to pull it off. So they had to ask for money. And then they got they got a lot of money. I can't say how much, but enough that I'm like, wow, you can get that kind of money for your high-minded video game? And they did. And then they hired a bunch of people to help them finish the game. And that's when it became really difficult and like hellish, because they went from just like 2 people working together and managing themselves to suddenly they're like the CEOs of a huge company, and they have to check on 20, 30 other people's schedules and check all their work, and they just become managers. And anyway, it part of, I think, the value of this book is just to see like how hard / maybe impossible it is to do this thing that they planned, and to sort of watch them as they confront the reality of how this thing that they made is starting to change.
Adam, thank you so much for joining us on the Coach House podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that's our show. Thanks to everyone who was on it. I'm your host, James Lindsay. Your producer was Andrew Kaufman. See you next time.